What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review the new film, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, a movie which I very foolishly believed when I first heard about it, maybe like a year or a year and a half ago. I was like, oh, this could be so cool. This is going to be this like brilliant animated epic, and it's going to take The Lord of the Rings of Power, and just put it in its grave. Well, The Lord of the Rings of Power might be well on its way to putting itself in its grave. However, after you see The War of the Rohirrim, you might pine for the days of The Lord of the Rings of Power, where even if that show is ridiculous in a lot of ways, at least it's kind of fun to mock and discuss. The War of the Rohirrim is so boring and so lifeless and so dull and so soulless and just so clunky and ugly in its animated style, it'll suck all the joy out of living right out of your body. And there are going to be plenty of people who will just refuse to believe it, and they'll say to themselves, there's no way the movie could be as bad as that god-awful show. But it's your money, it's your time, it's your energy. Spend it as you see fit. What I'm going to recommend is that everybody hunts down the appendices from the back of The Return of the King. If you go to Appendix A, Annals of the Kings and Rulers, they have a bunch of background information on the Númenóreans, as well as the Lords of Gondor, as well as all the Lords of Rohan, or how were they described? The House of Eorl, if I'm saying that correctly. But a few pages into it, the story of Helm Hammerhand begins, and a few short pages later, the story ends. But you can read those pages in about 5 minutes and get much more, more texture and rich detail and just much more interesting character building than in this entire bloated movie, which is, I think it's, 2 hours and 15 minutes long? 2 hours and 14 minutes long. It feels twice that length. I mean, I was in awe of just how boring it was, because it's a completely different kind of bad from The Lord of the Rings of Power, where The Rings of Power, at least it's so comically awful, you can kind of laugh uproariously at its expense. With this movie, you're just going to be like, why am I here? I never want to see anything with Lord of the Rings in the title ever again. I mean, the brand damage being done with this movie is tremendous, and I think we're rapidly reaching a point now where there are two different fan bases for The Lord of the Rings, where there are those people who will see or consume anything with The Lord of the Rings in the title. They are the clapping seals. They don't demand a lot from their entertainment. And then there are the millions of people who have been loving and adoring J.R.R. Tolkien going back to the late 30s. I mean, if you look over my shoulder, I've got a bunch of Tolkien books right there. I love Tolkien. I've read The Hobbit a couple times, I've read The Lord of the Rings many times, and I've read The Silmarillion many times, and it's just glorious. And I guess the only silver lining in all these terrible shows and movies is that each time one of them comes out, it encourages me to go back and reread some of Tolkien's work. But if you're one of the millions of people out there who really loves J.R.R. Tolkien's books and regards them as sacred and some of the best fantasy stories ever written, well, then you'll understand when I say that any filmmaker who's trying to make a show or a movie that adapts any part of J.R.R. Tolkien's work, we must demand excellence. We have to demand the best goddamn shows and movies ever made, and anything less than that is unacceptable. So at this point, you might be justifiably asking, who is responsible for this latest monstrosity with The Lord of the Rings in the title? And I'm going to blame lawyers, because according to this article or this post over on Wikipedia, it says the film was announced in June 2021 and development was fast-tracked to prevent New Line from losing the film adaptation rights for Tolkien's novels. There it is. This was a, I don't know, it's not like a money grab, because I don't think this movie's going to make any money, but whatever word we want to come up with for a soulless show or a soulless movie that is made expressly to hang on to the rights to a particular character, even if you don't have any good ideas or any good projects in development using that IP. And at this point, between The Rings of Power and this, I just want to say, can everybody just leave J.R.R. Tolkien alone? I mean, all these writers and all these directors who are attempting to adapt the world of Tolkien, clearly none of them have the talent or the ability or the experience or the taste or the judgment to pull it off. And don't get me wrong, I'm not some purist where I can't abide any adaptations of Tolkien. I'm going to post a link to a video down in the description below where I tackled all my favorite adaptations in the world of animation, live action, video games, paintings, etc. But I made that video, I think late summer, right before season 2 of The Rings of Power came out. But it is possible to make great adaptations, even if they are deeply flawed. Like The Return of the King, I regard as a deeply flawed movie where it's wildly uneven, and yet I saw it 6 times in the theater. I wept openly during certain scenes. I'm not immune to the appeal of a great Lord of the Rings adaptation. But it's like, either adapt the specific stories written by J.R.R. Tolkien, or please go fuck yourselves. And this movie, it pays lip service to adapting some of the stories about Helm Hammerhand. It adapts a few of the key scenes. But the biggest problem with this movie is that It doesn't invent a new character, but it basically fleshes out an unnamed character, and that is the beginning of where the story kind of flies off the rails, because if you're writing fan fiction, if you're inventing new narratives inside the world of Middle-earth, you are almost always doomed to fail. But if we want to mention everybody by name who was specifically responsible for this movie, here are all the vital stats from Wikipedia. The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim is a 2024 anime fantasy film directed by Kenji Kamiyama from a screenplay by Jeffrey Addis and Will Matthews and Phoebe Gittins and Artie Papageorgiou, based on characters created by J.R.R. Tolkien. But let me pause right there because this movie is not anime. Even if it was directed by a Japanese director, Kenji Kamiyama, for me, anime is Japanese animation that is, based on manga, like written by Japanese writers, directed by Japanese directors, starring Japanese talent, basically Japanese movies that are, whether they're done by traditional cell animation or whatever the case might be, that is anime or Japanimation, whatever word you want to use to describe it. But because anime is popular now, people are just slapping the anime a description of movies where it is undeserving. Any movie being produced by New Line Cinema and Warner Brothers Animation, I'm sorry, it's not anime no matter how broadly they wish to define it. It's just an adult animated movie, but they know in America, if you describe something as an adult animated movie, it is doomed to fail because Americans don't like going to see animation for adults for whatever reason. But it's doomed to fail no matter what because this movie completely sucks balls. But here's the official premise. Set 183 years before the events of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings film trilogy, The War of the Rohirrim tells the story of Helm Hammerhand, a legendary king of Rohan, and his family as they defend their kingdom against an army of Dunlendings. Helm goes on to be the namesake for the stronghold Helm's Deep. Really interesting how in that premise, they don't mention his daughter Hera at all, who is the star of the movie. Helm Hammerhand is in the movie quite a bit. But Hera is the star, and she's actually not named in Tolkien. All he does is just mention that she exists. But the official passage where she is referred to in the appendices, if you go to the section that introduces the character of Helm Hammerhand, the second paragraph deals with the beginning of the conflict that is at the core of the movie. But it says, to one of these councils, Freke rode with many men, and he asked the hand of Helm's daughter for his son Wolf. But Helm said, "You have grown big since you were last here, but it is mostly fat, I guess." And men laughed at that, for Freke was wide in the belt. In any case, it all goes downhill from there. There are some escalating tensions between these two groups of people, and we see most of the story from the point of view of Helm Hammerhand's daughter, Hera, who's basically her name and her personality is invented for this movie. But here's how it's described in Wikipedia. The tomboyish daughter of Helm who helps defend their people. Wise said that the character was closer to the female heroes from Hayao Miyazaki's anime films such as Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind, than Eowyn and Arwen, the female heroes in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. While those characters are fully formed women, Wise said Hera was rebellious and complicated. Shame on whoever this character is, Wise. Hang on. Gaia Wise, who's the actress playing her. But Nausicaa, The Valley of the Wind is a goddamn masterpiece. If you're looking for a great animated movie by a Japanese filmmaker, Hayao Miyazaki, where you actually do get to have an incredible female protagonist saving the day and kicking all kinds of ass, that's one of the best animated movies that I've ever seen. And to even mention War of the Rohirrim and Nausicaa in the same breath, it only compounds the humiliation and the subpar quality of this movie all the more. You don't want to compare yourself to one of the best animated movies ever fucking made. But in the context of this movie, Hera and the son of Freke, Wolf, are childhood friends. They grew up dueling and that sort of thing. And as the tensions between their people continue to escalate, naturally they're going to be the leaders that have to go to war. And anyway, there's like romantic tension because Wolf wants her as his wife and Hera doesn't want to marry anybody, blah, blah, blah. But I guess if I had to say something nice about the movie, hiring Brian Cox to be Helm Hammerhand, you could do worse. I mean, Brian Cox obviously is a living legend. His work on Succession was incredible, or movies like X2 or Manhunter. Brian Cox is a powerhouse, and he does do a good job of bringing Helm Hammerhand to life, especially in scene. There are one or two scenes from the actual appendices from Return of the King that are adapted kind of sort of vaguely accurately, but without any life or pulse or energy. And perhaps the most interesting scene in the movie is when we see Helm and Freke throw down early on. And here's the actual text from the appendices where it says, "Now Dunlending, said the king, you have only Helm to deal with, alone and unarmed. But you have said much already, and it is my turn to speak. Freke, your folly has grown with your belly. You talk of a staff. If Helm dislikes a crooked staff that is thrust on him, he breaks it. So, with that, he smote Freke such a blow with his fist that he fell back stunned and died soon after. Helm then proclaimed Freke's son and near kin the king's enemies, and they fled, for once Helm sent many men riding to the west marches." And the rest of the movie is basically concerned with this giant war that breaks out between the people of Rohan and the Dunlendings. And as written in the appendices, initially the battle goes, or the war goes horribly wrong for most people in Rohan, where their capital is sacked and burned and that sort of thing. The Dunlendings basically form common cause with a few other enemies that give them an initial advantage. And the most interesting stuff from the text, but not in the movie, is during that long, lonely winter, as Helm's Deep is earning its name, as the people of Rohan are starving, Helm will go out in the night like a wraith almost, and with his bare hands rip the enemies to pieces just to do some psychological warfare and fuck them all up. But it's what it's what gives Helm his incredible reputation over time as this just absolute wrath of God, hell on wheels fucking Viking who is not to be trifled with. And I did like how they tried in their own kind of pitiful way to incorporate as much of the appendices in this movie as possible. However, if what your main concern is telling a story or fleshing out the story of a character who Tolkien only mentions once and doesn't even bother to name, well then naturally you're going to jump the rails and go off into very boring terrain, because imitating the style of Tolkien is challenging. It's really hard to do. Even the best filmmakers who have done it, who have done the best job, even they struggle under the burden of making their stories feel Tolkien-esque, or however you want to describe it, whatever adjective you like. But this movie doesn't feel like Tolkien. It just feels, it's a little bit like when you take a bite of food that's about to give you food poisoning and you're like, something's a little off. And then you keep eating it because you're a hungry pig or just a total dumbass. And 6 hours later, you're like, oh God, why did I swallow it? Why did I eat that whole thing? I knew something was wrong. I could smell something was wrong. I could taste something was wrong. The flavor of this movie, everything is off. It's just so limp and uninspired. And all that, I guess if what you're looking for from a Lord of the Rings movie is all that soaring emotion that you experience during the best scenes in Peter Jackson's trilogy, none of that's here. But what makes it even worse, as you can feel those scenes where between the music and the visuals, they're reaching for it, they're straining for those emotions, but really coming up short. And this was not an inexpensive movie. It looks cheap and it feels cheap, but I'm seeing here, had a budget of $30 million. And obviously a $30 million budget is nothing compared to the $80 million that's used for a movie like Wild Robot, or the considerably larger numbers that are used for a movie like Moana 2 or something along those lines. But for $30 million, you can make a damn good movie. I mean, Godzilla -1, they made that for fucking $11 million. I mean, it was nothing. But the movie's trying really hard to connect it to Peter Jackson's movies with a few little details. I think the movie incorporates a few elements of Howard Shore's score. And I understand it. Howard Shore's scores for those three movies are some of my favorite scores that I've ever heard. As Peter Jackson told him when they were making the movies, I need the themes of the movie to be hummable. People need to walk out of the movie whistling and singing the Riders of Rohan theme song, or the Fellowship of the Ring theme song, or Gollum song, or whatever the case might be. And they did it over and over and over again. Howard Shore just gave him solid gold with one incredible song after another. It was a masterclass in big epic fantasy music composition. So they used some of that music, but when you hear that music that's familiar from a movie that came out in 2002, 22 years ago, it just underscores how good those movies were and how lifeless this movie is. And then you also have Miranda Otto doing the voiceover, and obviously Miranda Otto played Éowyn, who was fantastic in The Two Towers and Return of the King. And it just makes you all the more acutely aware of just how far this whole franchise has fallen. Like I said, any movie that is made just as a desperate attempt to hang on to the rights, as opposed to being made from a place of love and passion and dedication and craft and art, you're doomed to fail. And yeah, this movie, I have a feeling 5-6 months from now, no one will even remember that it even came out. But let's suppose you're one of those people that is totally in lockstep and really is rooting for and hoping for more female-led fantasy adventure movies, especially in the world of Tolkien. I mean, Tolkien obviously created Galadriel, who's a major character, but for the most part, the story features a lot of male characters and that sort of thing. So let's say you agree with the intentions of the writers with this movie, but ultimately I feel like a movie like this, it's self-defeating. It cuts off your own goals at the knees when you deliver a movie that's this boring and this lifeless. So people are going to just say, I don't want to see a movie where an old lady with a sword and shield can hold off a room full of Vikings who are 6'7", covered in battle axes and armor and that sort of thing. Because when you watch a scene like that, you don't think, what a powerful, badass character. I'm really invested Instead, you just say to yourself, like, well, I call bullshit. I just completely reject what I'm seeing because this is totally absurd. But those ingredients are not as prevalent in this film as you might suppose. Like a show like Star Wars The Acolyte is much more heavy-handed when it comes to those kind of storytelling choices and that sort of thing. So those ingredients are annoying and they're here, but it's just a few scenes here and there. The biggest problem this movie has is that it's just like chewing on cardboard. You're like, at what point am I going to encounter a scene or a moment that has like some flavor or some emotion or some drama, anything that'll allow me to get more emotionally invested in the story, and it just never happens. It's just mind-numbingly boring from start to finish. And I worry that Warner Brothers has more in store for us in the not-so-distant future because they're getting the band back together with Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Peter Jackson to do a Gollum movie. And there's basically like a page and a half of text that describes Gollum's adventures in between The Hobbit and where we pick up with him in Fellowship of the Ring. But there's not enough material there for an entire feature film, so inevitably they're going to have to invent a bunch of new material. And what were the worst ingredients from the 3 Hobbit movies that they made? All the crap they invented. Like The Hobbit should have been one great feature film. It's a pretty slender novel. Right up, where is it? Right here. There's not a lot of material there. It could have been one great epic movie, but no, they had to make 3-hour bloated monstrosities. And they were just dreadful because even the people who are the best at adapting Tolkien, Walsh, Boyens, and Jackson, even they are totally fucked when it comes to inventing new material. So once again, adapt the text that is there, adapt the material that's been written, or just please go away. But just to wrap up this video on a positive note, when I see a movie that's as bland and as forgettable as The War of the Rohirrim, it just makes me all the more appreciative of the good adaptations we've received in the past. Like Ralph Bakshi only got to make half of The Lord of the Rings with his Lord of the Rings film, but there are some scenes in that are incredible. Or Rankin and Bass with their adaptation of The Hobbit from the late 70s. That was incredible. Obviously, the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I think The Fellowship of the Ring is a strong contender for one of the best fantasy movies ever made. I mean, I'm wearing a Conan shirt, so my loyalty will probably always rest with Conan the Barbarian. But if you like fantasy movies, there are not a ton of great ones to choose from. Like I grew up in the time of Dragon Slayer, which was really cool, and Beastmaster. Like the early 80s, definitely there was like a fantasy renaissance in a lot of ways, which led to a lot of almost kind of like semi-softcore porn rip-off, like low-budget fantasy movies that are fun to watch and have great like Boris Vallejo posters and that sort of thing, but aren't all that good. But if you love the fantasy genre, the reality is you just need to read a lot more books. And just in case you want to accuse me of being, I guess, like stubborn and obstinate when it comes to modern day interpretations of fantasy, I'm reading a book right now, The Empire of the Damned by Jay Kristoff, which is the sequel to Empire of the Vampire. And I think it came out either in 2023 or 2024. But anyway, the book's brand new, and it's got medieval fantasy and vampires and spells and shape changers and all the trappings of a great fantasy story and a lot of horror as well. But it is brand spanking new, very, very modern in its approach, and it's very addictive and very compellingly written. And so once again, I'm always open to and craving new fantasy experiences. Or Joe Abercrombie, who wrote the First Law series, he has a new fantasy series starting next spring. I think the first book's just called The Devils, and I'm eagerly anticipating that. So it's like I crave fantasy. I love fantasy. Or video games. I've been playing Path of Exile 2 recently, but obviously there are games like Baldur's Gate 3 and Elden Ring. If you're open to games, books, and movies and shows, well then you have a much better chance of finding the good stuff. But the reality is the good stuff's in the books, and once in a blue moon, once on a very, very, very rare occasion, the movies will manage to get it right. But there are precious few to choose from. So the good ones that we have, like Fellowship of the Ring, they are all the more precious as a result. My precious. But I'm officially getting off topic and no longer discussing the War of the Rohirrim, and that's because there's just so little to discuss that it's worth getting excited about. I mean, the action is just so bland and so lifeless, where it's just like, even as people are clashing swords and throwing spears at each other, everything just feels slow and herky-jerky and awkward. It's just a complete and total misfire, which absolutely feels like a rights play as opposed to a movie. But I guess if, like in the final analysis, is it worth it to drive to the theater and slap down $20 to see this movie? Absolutely hell no. Your time is much better spent doing just about anything else. Spend $20 on a copy of The Lord of the Rings, and then read the appendices. Once again, in Appendices A, all the stories you could ever want about Helm Hammerhand are there. They're not that many of them, but you'll have much more fun reading those pages than you will watching this movie. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up this video. Hope you weren't too turned off by my negativity. If you want to hear me do a positive rant, check out my video on Nosferatu, where I embarrassed myself drooling all over the movies. So that comes out in 2 weeks' time. I strongly recommend everybody ignore War of the Rohirrim and go see Nosferatu instead. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has a great weekend, and I'll be back at you tomorrow with my review for Kraven the Hunter. But thanks again for watching. I greatly appreciate it, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.